Welcome. Today we have Niamh Wright with us from the Community Building Partnerships team, who is going to talk to us a bit about the CBP grant. Niamh, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Happy to be here.
We're really grateful to have you. I know P&Cs are big applicants in the CBP grant space, so we're very lucky that you're here to tell us a bit more. Would you like to, for those who aren't familiar with the Community Building Partnerships grant, tell us a bit about it?
So the Community Building Partnership Grant Program, or CBP for short, we work with the Premier's Department to deliver positive social, recreational and environmental outcomes. And we do that by giving funds for small infrastructure programs all across New South Wales. If you're part of an unincorporated organisation, a not-for-profit, you're eligible to apply for between $10,000 and $100,000 for your local project.
Amazing. And we know that the vast majority of P&Cs in New South Wales are incorporated associations under our Incorporated Associations Act for P&Cs. So they are the prime candidates for this particular grant.
Yes.
That's brilliant. What sort of projects might they want to apply for as a P&C association? What's been successful in the past?
So a lot of P&Cs will apply for different projects on public school grounds. That might be things like shade covers. It might be like the sports courts or sports grounds resurfacing or line markings, and also any other kind of community projects like a little community garden, planter boxes or shed on public school grounds.
Oh, that's absolutely brilliant. That's exactly what we're looking for. So we know that there are lots of different moving pieces when you're going through a grant application process. What sort of time frames should we be looking at for this particular grant round?
For the application itself, about 50% of our applicants report 2 to 5 hours writing up an application. I suspect for P&Cs it'll be a bit longer because P&Cs will have to work with the school, they'll have to get their approvals and documents all ready to go. So maybe between 5 to 8 or 10 hours over the application period is probably a good ballpark figure to time.
That's really helpful, and I mean, it sounds manageable given that it is something that is going to be very advantageous for them to go through. How long do they have before this particular round for applications closes?
So the deadline is next Friday, 21st of February, 5 p.m, very sharp. That's the deadline to get applications in online. And then it takes us a while to process and do all the checks and send for approval. So P&Cs are not going to find out the result until August this year in 2025. And then it's a 12-month time frame to get that project finished by August 2026. So importantly, this project, whatever it may be, is probably going to get handed over to the next P&C next year. So having that time frame in mind, the 12-month project period, is probably pretty key to understand when you're writing the application.
That's really helpful. And for our P&Cs out there, we can, as the P&C Federation, when you go through that handover after your AGM, we're always happy to support you with succession planning to make sure you are able to hand over the grant to the next round of office bearers so that it doesn't end up falling by the wayside partway through. Niamh, can you tell us a little bit more about any particular tips or tricks that our P&Cs should be aware of when they're applying?
So importantly, reading our guideline documents. We've got heaps of frequently asked questions. You don't have to read the guidelines from cover to cover. You can skim and scan and skip the pieces that aren't relevant to a P&C or are not relevant to the type of project that the P&C is applying for. But most of all the answers are in there. Our program, we like the projects to be what we call shovel ready, meaning everything's been approved by the school and the Department of Education. All the documents, the quotes, the budgets, everything's ready. So when the results are announced by August this year, the project can just kick off and start getting ready.
Oh, that's fantastic. So when they're working with their school principal, are there any things that you would suggest they need to be aware of as part of either the application process or even the acquittals process down the line?
Yes. Importantly, this year we're asking for the approval from the school to be attached to the application. So that's different from historical applications. What that means is contacting the school, working with the department's asset management unit to get the approval, and that approval needs to be printed out or scanned and attached to the application.
And so we know that obviously a P&C does have a very close working relationship with their principal and their school leadership in general. When it comes to the grant application process, where do the funds go if they're successful, and what do they then do with those funds when they interact with the school?
Yes, so glad you asked that question. So with the CBP program, we're going to arrange a funding agreement between the P&C and the CBP grant program. So that means the P&C office bearers will have to be the ones who sign the contract, and it'll be the P&C bank account details that we're going to ask for to transfer the funds. So our relationship is primarily with the P&C Association. And then, of course, we assume that the P&C will work with the Department of Education, the school, to get the project done. Other than that, we're not too fussed about how the project gets done, as long as it's, done to regulation and all that kind of thing. And then at the end of the project, again, we ask for acquittal or a completion report from the P&C. So those documents and those signatories from office bearers, they all need to be from the P&C, and we don't really work with the school at all once the project is undergoing.
So the P&C are really the owners of this process, but they are there to make sure that the funds are transferred to the Department of Education to work with managing a project. Is that a fair understanding, or do you think it's more nuanced than that?
My understanding is, yes, the P&C works with the school or the Department of Education, but in terms of the grant agreement and the grant management and the grant acquittal, the direct relationship is more directly between the P&C Association and CBP.
That's fantastic, because I think it's really sometimes challenging as a new time volunteer working out what your role is in a process that has a couple of different areas with which you need to liaise. So that's really helpful, Niamh. Thank you so much. And for our P&Cs out there, for any office bearers that are concerned, perhaps you might have multiple bank accounts, you're not sure where to have the funds directed, you have any questions about who your signatories are on your accounts, those sorts of questions, either process questions or governance questions, please always tap into our member services team. We're more than happy to liaise with you to resolve any of those questions you might have. Niamh, thank you so much. I do note that you mentioned that P&Cs are going to have to work with the asset management unit, and we're lucky enough today to have a second guest with us. So would you mind if I now say thank you very much?
You're very welcome.
And we'll bring in Dean.
Okay.
Dean, thank you so much for coming in. We're so grateful to have you.
That's a pleasure, Gemma.
Now, you're a bit of Department of Education royalty. For anyone who is not familiar with school infrastructure, or more specifically, the Asset Management Unit, Dean Slattery is the Executive Director of the AMU. And if you haven't come across them yet, you are going to as a P&C office bearer. So, Dean, why don't you give us a bit of background about what AMU is?
Sure. So Asset Management Units, we're a 600-strong workforce right around the state, servicing all the 2,200 schools. Our primary role is maintenance, effectively. We're relationship managers in the school community, so we are, I guess, the shop front for schools to come and talk about their asset issues. We also look after planned maintenance works and minor capital works for integration of students with disabilities into mainstream schools, lifts, ramps, etc., and also some minor capital works up to around 10 million.
Fantastic. So not only do we owe you a debt of gratitude, but I know we're going to be interacting with you as part of, in particular, the CBP grant.
Quite a lot, yes.
Yeah. So can you tell us about, from that real common sense perspective, I'm a P&C office bearer and this is my first time going through the grants process. I have been successful. I'm really excited. Now what do I do?
So the best point of contact is straight through your school principal. We'd ask you to reach out to them, and we're happy to come to a meeting and come along and demystify the process for you at that meeting. It's a little bit tricky to do it outside of business hours, but if we can get P&C representatives to the school during those hours, we're happy to sit down and have a coffee and work our way through that process for you.
That's such an exciting offer, because I know that sometimes you really need that hands-on approach to get these big projects or even small projects over the line. So thank you very much. We do
it's a pleasure.
appreciate that. And when P&C is talking to their principal about the grant application, when they're thinking about what it is they would like to do, what would you suggest they do in terms of that approach?
Again, if they'd like to have us come out and help walk them through that, we're happy to do that. Each asset service officer who looks after, they have 10 schools that they manage, and they have a pretty intimate knowledge of the problems that may be in the school. For example, there may be some old hazardous material at the back of a site that we're aware of, and we can probably guide you through whether that's a good idea to work in that space or not. So we're happy to work through that.
That's really interesting, because I think as a parent in a school myself, I'm certainly not aware of all of the different bits and pieces that go on in the background that might be on record for our particular school. And I might have an initiative that I want to put into the school, but don't have the requisite knowledge to make that a reality. So if I approach my principal and say, I've got this idea, could we please arrange a meeting with asset management? You're happy to?
100%. The ASO will come out and meet with you, and they'll walk you through what they understand of the, I guess, limitations of the site, or some of the opportunities you may be able to get there.
Fantastic. If the grants process, and this might have been a better question for Niamh, but if the grant application for CBP in this particular area is successful, and we then uncover along the line that there is a hazardous material on the school site or something to prevent a project going forward, what would your suggestion be?
So obviously the first thing would be we'd be ceasing work at that point, and we'll work with you around, depending on the scale of that problem, we'll probably try and come up with some solutions for you. We're very mindful of hazardous material on sites. There are occasions where we manage that, but definitely reach out through the AMUs and we'll sit down and work through that process with you.
Fantastic, because that cooperative approach is so important. I know that we're all working to build thriving school communities, so the fact that we know that you're there as an asset, no pun intended, to lean on, I think is going to be really valuable to our P&C members. Who would you suggest is the best point of call if they have any future questions, whether it's at the start of the application process or later on, in terms of getting a project off the ground?
Yeah, again, the site manager is the school principal, so we generally don't have direct interaction with P&C, but if you reach out through your school, we're happy to come out and meet with you or take your questions on notice and respond to that back for you.
So that's a huge job that principals have, being also a site manager of a school, managing staff. I mean, that is something that we all need to remember when we're going through this process, isn't there?
They do a lot of work in various places. I mean, asset management units are there primarily to help support school principals make good choices and understand their obligations around the asset. But we are definitely a support unit that sits in behind them.
Brilliant. And do you have any insight into the sort of trends we've seen in the last 12 months about the sorts of projects that have been successful?
Similar to what Niamh was saying, they generally are around the landscape area, so generally sports fields, new basketball courts. Landscaping is very popular. They're probably the three big ones that generally will get a Guernsey.
And is there anything that you would say, if you've got this brilliant idea, we've seen it tried, slow your roll a little bit, ask some questions before you apply, things that might not be successful?
Yeah, and that's part of the application process as well. So we do a bit of due diligence on behalf of the school. So the school principal, I'll take it back a step a bit. Asset management units have delegated authority to act as landholders under the Crown. So primarily, we would provide landholder consent at the application piece, and that was what Niamh was referring to earlier. That's through the project proposals section of the FM web system that we use with schools. What I'd say to you is when the school puts that application in, there is a drop down we've put in this year that says grant application, which will allow us to track and get to those faster. But I'd definitely ask the principal to reach out to their ASO so we can manage that really quickly, given we've got a very short runway to get these applications in. So that's pretty critical.
For our background, can you give us a bit of sort of context to what a principal might be working with in terms of that? Sorry, was it the FMU you referred to?
Web.
Oh,
so
FM Web.
FM Web is our call-out system for breakdowns in the system. So, example, if you have a light that's not working in a classroom, you would put a logger call in FM Web and say, St Peter's Public School, room AR 1001, my light's not working. that will trigger a call to us, and then we'll assign a contractor to go out and repair that work. The other side of that is the project proposals button, where they can apply for grant applications are one, and also for school and community applications for us to support them by doing projects on their behalf.
Fantastic.
So there's 2 areas.
That is really insightful, because it gives us an idea of what our principal will have to do in terms of their uplift when interacting with AMU. So it's really good context for us. Is there anything else that you would suggest as a tip or trick that our P&C should be aware of through this process?
No, not really. It's pretty self-explanatory. We do the due diligence piece from the grant application. So we'll check for potential hazardous materials. We'll check to make sure there's no structural work that will compromise the integrity of the asset. We'll also make sure it meets the educational facility standards, so that the build we're going to do is going to be complementary to that school for the next 20, 30 years. Those are sort of the things we'll do, and if we see that they all tick the right boxes for us, then we'll provide that landholder consent, which the P&C and the school will be able to attach to the application.
And when it comes to acquitting the grant, going through the process of actually handing funds over, how does that work? You know, we've heard examples where P&Cs have gone out and sourced quotes, full of rigour and excitement.
And it's all that enthusiasm piece.
Exactly.
Look, to make it very, to demystify that, below $50,000, there is no obligation to go through a competitive tendering process as per the New South Wales government procurement regulations. So if you were looking at a project that's above $50,000 inclusive of GST, we have an obligation to be competitive tendering that process. So that's where you'll see AMUs get involved, and we'll invite 2 or 3 people. They have to be in what's termed Scheme 0256, which is the New South Wales Whole of Government Procurement Scheme. A lot of our contractors are, and a lot of the people that P&Cs work with are already in that. However, if they're not, we can support P&Cs to get a contractor onboarded into that system, so we can invite them to tender for that above $50,000 work. Below $50,000, we can generally use a single source quote from a local contractor who doesn't necessarily need to be in that scheme. So that's the nuance.
Wow, that's really helpful. It sounds like there's a lot to remember, but at the end of the day, we've got the opportunity to talk to your team to get those, best outcomes for a school.
I would honestly suggest we set up a meeting in the first instance with the schools and sit down and talk about what budget you're talking around, and then we can give you that advice about what's appropriate, whether to go and source a quote locally or whether best to wait for us and we'll come and do that procurement piece for you.
So that's going to save a lot of headaches, lot of running around and a lot of time. Thank you, Dean.
100%.
Dean, that is incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. So reach out to your school principal as a first point of call, I think, is the takeaway. I think that's fair to say.
I think it is.
Build that collaborative relationship. Don't be afraid to lean on us as the P&C Federation for any of those governance or process questions. Don't be afraid to reach out via your principal to the Asset Management Unit. And I wish you the absolute best of luck with this grant application round. And don't forget that there will be another round later in the year. So keep an eye on this space, and we will be bringing you all of that information in due course. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Gemma.